Okay, I'll go ahead and start. I'm Melanie Ochoa, board member with ACLU of Southern California.
Edgar Hampton, representing PORAC.
I am Steve Raphael, the Goldman School of Public Policy, UC Berkeley, and representing the governor's office.
LaWanda Hawkins, um, Justice for Murdered Children.
Brendan Woods, Public Defender of Alameda County, representing California Public Defender Association.
And we can go ahead, since we have a quorum right now, to approve the minutes. So I'll make a motion to approve the minutes.
I'll second. I got to read those earlier today.
And we can take a vote. I don't know. I don't know if you make the motion or second the motion if you actually need to vote on the motion, but I will vote yay on the motion for the record.
Yay.
Yay.
Aye.
Great. Thank you all. And so I think the next item on the agenda, or the first substantive item, is the DOJ update and post comments on training. So who from the DOJ is going to speak on that?
Hi everyone, this is Allison Elgart from DOJ. Wanted to give you all a brief update on, so we are going to hear from Post in a few minutes about an update on the supervisors training that you all had discussed last year and earlier this year. And then through the course of this meeting, I know you all started your discussion on the principal policing LD3 training. So we'll work on wrapping up that discussion and seeing what, if any, recommendations you all have coming from that. We're also going to have a discussion and some presentation by Post on AB 846, and that was the law that was passed to add in bias to the evaluation of potential peace officers for officer as part of the evaluation for peace officer candidates, and also to have the job descriptions of law enforcement change from de-emphasizing the paramilitary focus and emphasizing a focus on community. So we are going to have a discussion on the what's been going on with AB 846 and Post's process with that, and then introduce to you all, some of the information that was in the report, and have a discussion about AB 846 and whether the subcommittee, has any recommendations or suggestions or feedback on that. So, that's really the course of the meeting. Some of you did review some communications modules, which we discussed in the draft. So during the discussion about the report, if you have comments on anything in the draft that you saw there, we're also happy to take those. We just wanted to try to, given the limited time we have, to focus in your attention on the ones that, we think there's going to be more coming out from the subcommittee to potentially present to the board at the October meeting. So with that, I will turn it over to Megan to give you all an update on the supervisor's course and if there are any other updates on other courses.
Good afternoon. My name is Megan Katafi. I am the Legislative Liaison and PIO for Post. Happy to be here. So I was asked to comment briefly, just give an update on our supervisor's course that we've been talking about for a little while now. On July 15th, Post provided a written response to DOJ stating that the implicit bias and profiling self-paced refresher course for supervisors is not intended to and will not meet the training mandates for AB 953. This course is a companion course to the implicit bias and profiling course that is mandated by AB 953. It's designed to incorporate local agency policies, and it's more of a tool and or self-assessment for the supervisor. So just to help clarify a little bit, so all officers are required to take the racial and identity profiling update course. The supervisor course that we are still currently developing, this is in addition to that update course. It's not a replacement of, so it's specifically for supervisors. So the POST program manager developing the two training products is the same person. POST is also using the same vendor for the development of both courses to ensure the consistency of the video and of the messaging. The POST program manager has used consistent language and representation provided by the RIPA board throughout both courses. More specifically, she incorporated the feedback noted in the development of the supervisor's update course. The two courses are being developed in parallel, and we feel we have received sufficient input that we've already incorporated those suggestions into both courses from the board. So the feedback that POST received from the RIPA board for the bias and racial profiling video and for the racial and identity profiling update self-paced course, I know it's a mouthful, was used to inform the design of the supervisor course. And although POST has not planned for additional feedback on the course, we are open to sending a link to the supervisor course to interested board members for the sake of transparency, and feedback on the course would need to be returned by next Friday, September 15th, to be considered for inclusion. There's been a lot of delays that continue to impact our delivery timeline on this course due to COVID, and we anticipate the course being released on our learning portal in October of this year.
Thank you, Megan. I just want to be clear, just to understanding what's all happening. The supervisor's course that you're talking about is the supervisor's course that is a companion to which course again?
It's the companion course to the racial and identity profiling update. It's a mandated refresher course that every officer takes.
That's the video refresher for in-service officers. That's 2 hours. I'm just trying to connect it to the things
I know, it's confusing.
I'm sorry?
I said I know, it can be confusing.
So that's it, okay. And so can you just tell me a little bit what is in the supervisor's course so I can understand kind of how it differs from the refresher course?
So I'm going to ask my colleague, Sharday Alcaraz, to talk about that because she's the one who is developing the video.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, perfect. Hello. So I am working on the supervisor course, the update course, the refresher course. So the update course, Melanie, you asked if it was the same as the 2-hour video. It is not. The video is a different course. So we have a 2-hour video. We have a self-paced course. The time on it, I haven't timed it yet, so I'm not exactly sure how long it'll take, but that is going to be the more interactive version of that course that you all have been previously working with Catherine Bacon-Davis on. So that is one of the courses. And then the third course that we're working on is the supervisor course. And that's going to be a course that really goes over, as a supervisor, do you know your agency policy on reporting biases? Or if an individual came to you with a bias, would you be prepared to deal with that? It also deals with, just supervisory issues. How do you handle reports of profiling while still considering all of these other obligations like POBAR rights and different things. So it also has a segment on suggestions for evaluating or really self-assessing. Are you connecting with your community? It gives some suggestions on how to connect with the community, how to set up programs at your department that can kind of bridge that gap. So it's truly it's like a self-assessment. It's more of a tool for supervisors to see, am I in line? Am I, is my agency prepared to implement some of the things that are covered in the update refresher course? So that's pretty much the supervisor course in a nutshell. We did take a lot of the feedback that we received from the 2 other courses and really honed our messaging, honed some of the representation in that course based on the feedback that we previously received. So that's a little bit about the supervisor course. I can, answer any more questions if you have them too.
And thank you for that. And just so I understand what Megan initially said, I thought she said that we weren't going to review it, but then we could review it if we want to, as long as we have it in by next Friday. Is that?
Yes, exactly. So yeah, we took a bunch of the feedback that we had gotten previously, we incorporated it, in the design phase, and right now we're really just, adding the coding so that it's, written in HTML5 and can go on our learning portal. So we're kind of at a stage where we're getting ready to finish, add the finishing coding and release that course. But, it seems like there's a lot of interest in reviewing the course from the subcommittee. So, for the sake of transparency, we're, happy to send that link out and, get any more feedback that you guys might want. The content's a little bit different. It's not quite the same as the refresher course. So I'm not sure how much, feedback you guys may have or want for that one. But again, the opportunity is there and we are kind of on a tight timeline, but, we still wanted to offer that because it seems like there's a significant level of interest in it.
So it seems like maybe at this point, it's not really feedback or review, it's just like to look at it, because it seems like you're just finalizing everything now, making it in the final form, but there's not really space to make any substantive changes if we do see things that are concerning.
I wouldn't say that that's an accurate statement. No, we have plans, to release it in October. This is where we are. We haven't begun coding it. We're not, it's not in its final state. So it's not like we're bringing you a course that cannot change because it's not coded and developed yet. So there is room, there is some room there. So we just ask that we can get it in quickly so that we do have time to consider it.
Would you be able to get that out to folks today then?
Yeah, we should have the link probably, I'd say tomorrow, midday by the latest, but it could go out today depending on when I'm getting some things.
Okay, thank you for that. I don't want to, if other people have questions. Okay. Was there anything else, Megan? I don't see her on my screen anymore. Maybe she disconnected. But was there anything else from Post for this update?
Update I was asked to provide. Yeah.
Megan, can I add to that? Hi, Melanie. This is Roseanne Ritchell with Post, Bureau Chief. We've met in prior meetings. I just want to, hello everybody who I have not met yet. I just wanted to reiterate what Sharday has told you. By getting that link out, we'll need everybody who needs to see it. If we don't want to keep postponing this because we do want to get this product out because it has been delayed due to COVID. But if we can get those names and the correct emails, and I don't know if we'll do that through DOJ, through Allison or Aisha, but if we can get those today so that Sharday can package it all up and then send it out to everybody at the same time, that would be best for us, and then also give you adequate time to review the product and then get it back to us. We're also looking not only from you, we're in the final stages of getting a review from the subject matter experts that created the course too. So we want to have it all in at the same time and not have this bifurcated and step type approach to it. We want to get it going.
Thank you for that. So maybe just also because some folks are not on right now that are part of the subcommittee, if DOJ could just send everyone's name and email that's on the subcommittee to post so they can get that just sent out, and then folks who have the interest can just click the link. If you just give a little description of what it is so they know if they weren't able to attend today. That'd be the fastest way to move forward.
We'll get
And I
that to
think
you this afternoon.
perfect. And then I just think so. Thank you for still giving us the opportunity to look at this. I think given what we talked in our previous conversations about, posts update schedule. So once something is a product, it takes a while before it comes back to get redone. So think it's great to have still as many opportunities to get it right before it's packaged and sent out, so that there aren't concerns about the way officers are being trained for years until it comes back. So I do appreciate wanting to get it out on schedule, but I think it's also very important to get it out in a way that is actually the most valuable to officers and to the community that they serve. And I don't know if I'm trying to find the agenda again. Is Post also speaking on anything else? If not, I just had one kind of question first for Post, and anyone who's there can answer. But if you're coming back to speak on something else, I can wait.
We will have a presentation on a brief one on AB 846, and then I believe at least some of the Post staff will be hopefully sticking around for discussion of training and board reports, since that is, about some of the other training. But also, if there's anything you'd like to address now, please go ahead, Melanie.
Wait for then. But I'm having a really hard time finding what screen the agenda is on. So if DOJ can let me know what the next thing is we're supposed to be discussing.
Sure. So the next thing is the presentation by DOJ on hiring and AB 846. So I'm going to turn it over to Tony for that. Tony, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Before we get started today with our discussion of AB 846, I just wanted to give you a sense of the flow of this section of the presentation. So we'll start first with an introduction to the AB 846 and its legislative history. And then we'll turn next to Post-Selection Standards Program Manager Melanie Singley, and she'll provide an update on the phases of the Post-AB 846 project. And then from there, we'll turn to my colleague, Tanya Koshi, and she'll provide a review of the research that we covered on AB 846 and some of the alternatives to bias testing. And then in addition to a discussion on the post-AB 846 proposed regulations. And then lastly, we want to be sure to provide the subcommittee an opportunity to consider the presentation and to consider potential actions that we'd like to take in light of the information presented. So I'll get started now. So AB 846 was first introduced in the summer of 2020, along with a wave of policing reform bills in the wake of the George Floyd killing and the 2020 racial justice protest. And the legislation's rationale is to ensure that peace officers are free from explicit and implicit bias against race, ethnicity, gender, nationality, religion, disability, and sexual orientation. So the bill's authors, they noted that the criticality of requiring the screening of officers and believed that this was a way to counteract the influence of dangerous biases in law enforcement. And the authors also noted here that by revising standards for evaluations of peace officers, that it would help to reform the system as it currently exists and to move us in a direction of equity. So what are those components? What are those components of AB 846? Well, we have a revision of minimum standards for California police officers, Post is now required to study, review, and update regulations and screening materials for the ID of explicit and implicit bias. And it required law enforcement agencies to review job descriptions used in recruitment and hiring and to make changes emphasizing community-based policing and de-emphasizing the paramilitary aspects of the job. But our focus today is to look at components 1 and 2, the revision of the minimum standards and the post requirement to study, review, and update the regs. So under the first component, as noted earlier, the revision of minimum peace officer standards provides that peace officers shall be found free from bias against race, ethnicity, gender, nationality, religion, disability, sexual orientation that might adversely affect the exercise of the powers of the peace officers, and that the emotional and mental condition of a candidate shall be evaluated by a psychiatrist or a psychologist. So per AB 846, the psychological evaluation shall be based on peace officers' duties, powers, demands, and working conditions as defined by the department. This information is then provided to the psychological evaluator, allowing the evaluator to make a psychological suitability determination. The evaluation takes place against, at a minimum, of job-related constructs within the post-peace officer psychological screening dimensions. And then lastly, psychological evaluators shall use the bias assessment framework to assess biased behaviors, biased attitudes, and bias-relevant traits and attributes. So both Melanie and Tanya will discuss the bias assessment framework in greater detail further along within this presentation. So as mentioned before, the second component under AB 846 is that the legislation required Post to study, review, and update regulations and screening materials for the identification of explicit and implicit bias. Now this work right here specifically is covered under the work by the Post AB 846 project. And this includes the establishment of the subject matter expert panel who provided recommendations for the implementation of the AB 846 requirements. Now, for this section of the presentation, I'd like to introduce Post Selection Standards Program Manager Melanie Singley, and she'll come on now to discuss this work, the work that was done by the AB 846 project, and provide an overview of those outcomes. Melanie?
Good afternoon, and thank you, Tony, for that introduction. And thank you for allowing me to present to your subcommittee today on this, what has been an extensive process over the last few months. As indicated, Post had until January 1st, 2022 to study, review, and make recommendations and changes in regulations and in screening materials. As such, to initiate this project, we sent a survey out to our current screening psychologists. So we have a list of psychological evaluators on our website who conduct pre-employment screening. We sent a survey out to find out exactly what they're currently doing in relation to bias screening, because we do address, currently we address bias screening in both our psychological screening dimensions and in the background investigation dimension. So they're covered under social competence and other areas. So they're currently doing that. However, we wanted to know exactly where they're getting their information from. So we sent a survey out to the psychologists asking for that information. Then we developed a panel of experts who were well versed in this issue, implicit and explicit bias. The panel consisted of our panel chair, Dave Corey, who is also the co-author of our psychological screening manual. He's been involved in screening peace officer candidates for 4 decades. And then we invited other SME panel members to be part of that group. They are, they're recognized for research in police performance as well as explicit and implicit bias training. I think you guys have those panel members' names. So there's Karen Amendola with the National Police Foundation. There's Calvin Lai, who is a professor at Washington University, who also works with Project Implicit. So that's the implicit association test. Jack DeVideo, John DeVideo, who's Yale University, works on implicit bias and intergroup relations. And then Rayshawn Ray, who is the executive director of the law enforcement social research. So they not only is he involved in implicit, issues within communities, he also is, their program also works on developing implicit bias training as well. So that was our subject matter expert panel group during April, May, June, I think started in March through May. We had a series of 4 meetings. We exchanged literature based on what our goal was. And essentially the panel was going to look at the survey results. They were going to, essentially the initial part of this was they were going to determine if there were any models that existed for assessing implicit and explicit bias. Are there any methods that exist that could validly assess or quote unquote identify implicit explicit bias? And if not, and if there were no assessments or models that you could use that would address groups in a personnel selection context, because that's what we're looking for, right, is personnel selection. What does the literature shows as far as how we can meet this mandate, to address those issues in selection? So they reviewed the survey results from the screening psychologists. They did a literature review. Jack DeVideo and Calvin Lai, I think I provided copies of that to you guys as well. Extensive review on what kind of data is out there. As you probably are aware, there's not a ton of data, especially related to police and bias and screening. There are currently no assessments that exist that specifically are geared towards personnel selection that have been validated for that purpose. As a result of their research, we developed this bias assessment framework. The bias assessment framework was essentially, because we're looking at current regulations and what's currently done in screening, it envelops the current data sources that are required to be used in peace officer screening. And so that's the background personal history information, that's assessment, so psychological exams basically, and then the psychological interview. So we kind of encompass those, and then we develop these list of constructs. And I don't know if, Tony, you want me to go into that or if somebody else is going to go into that, but the list of constructs essentially were, bias behaviors, bias attitudes, and bias relevant traits and attributes. And each of those construct areas would then be reviewed in each of those various data sources. So background information. So it also involves the background investigation. So that's where it's important to get that information from the background investigator, and the background investigator is also looking for that information. We currently have questions regarding, are you involved in, do you have any tattoos signifying, bias against groups? There are several guidance documents, if you will, so a reference questionnaire that asks these questions currently. That doesn't mean we can't explore adding to those items to gather more information. Our background dimensions also, and there's a bulletin that went out back in, I think, September of 2020 that addresses how we currently address that. It doesn't mean that it can't be expanded upon. So this bias, in addition to this bias assessment framework, we also developed this kind of a guidance table that would help both the screening psychologist and the background investigator kind of develop those questions and develop those resources in order to kind of address bias. The table also discusses what we call aggravating, mitigating factors. So factors that would have a negative influence on the peace officer's behaviors, and then mitigating factors. So factors that would have a positive influence or would counteract possibly what would be negative behaviors. And so that's found, and again, I think you have that in part of your information as well. That's found in the table the bias recommendations. So it's basically recommendations on what they can look for. That is a non-exhaustive list. That's not a regulatory requirement because we anticipate that that will probably change over time, you know, as we come up with other areas that may need to be focused, you know, that are going to address bias. I think the issue now is there's not a lot of data out there that assesses bias in essentially the outcome of a selection tool for when hiring an individual. There's no outcome data. One of the questions we asked on the survey was how many screening psychologists receive outcome data from their agencies. The response was very few, essentially. It was limited. It's like 26% of the 80 people that responded say they receive outcome data, and only from certain agencies. So there's that kind of missing piece as well, is that you hire someone and maybe they're terminated in 6 months or a year during FTO. There's not that outcome data. So there's not a lot of data indicating what kind of the outcome of these things are. I think that's part of the piece. But as far as the regulations are concerned and our requirements and what we're looking for, there is information where what we're moving forward with is the bias assessment framework. So framework they need to use in assessing bias. And then the regulations that indicates that the psychological evaluation has to include that bias assessment framework. The background investigation has to also include using that bias assessment framework, so making sure that they're addressing those areas. And then also we're adding multicultural competence to the list of competencies for screening psychologists. So they currently have a list of 8 competencies they're required to meet. And so we're adding multicultural competence to ensure that those who are screening candidates also are familiar with the differences in race, religion, that sort of thing. So that's just another caveat. So I don't know if you have questions or if you want me to go through the regulations line by line or what sort of information.
Melanie, hi, Melanie. Thank you so much. This is Tanya Koshi from DOJ. That was a really helpful overview, and I want to give the board members opportunity to ask you questions, but I also was going to unpack a little bit of what you had talked about with respect to the proposed regulation. So if you can stay on, it would be helpful maybe for me to continue on with the presentation and then then give the subcommittee members an opportunity to ask questions. And feel free to chime in during my presentation to the extent there's anything you want to add or correct. Great. So thanks again, Melanie. So I want to, before we talk about the proposed regulations that Melanie referenced, I want to do a very brief overview of the research that Tony and I reviewed, which is reflected in this section of the report on AB 846. That's on page 22 of your meeting materials. And I think the first thing I want to point out is that at the outset, we noted that AB 846 is a really important and critical bill because it looks at policing reform at the front end when people are being hired. But there are, some challenges with the bill, and our section of the report notes that. And specifically, a threshold issue is whether it's even possible to find people who meet the literal standard set by AB 846, which is people who are free of bias. The social psychologists we have reviewed who focus on bias research have commented that it's not possible necessarily to find people who are free of bias, and the focus should be more on managing people's biases. A second threshold issue, which Melanie raised, is that there is no precise assessment tool or tool to assess people's implicit biases. And there was, an article quoting a social psychologist who noted that AB 846 is sort of based on this mistaken assumption that there is some sort of easy or accurate test to assess people's biases. The most commonly referenced one is the implicit association test, which some of you might be familiar with. That's located online, developed by Harvard. It has some mixed reception. There are some studies that validated it and others that have reached the opposite conclusion. So our
our research is actually somewhat in line with this post subject matter expert panel, and that is that there is no research that we could find that assesses how to evaluate bias, particularly in a personnel context, nor in the law enforcement context, which I think is critical here to effectuate the goals of AB 846. So since we're a little short on time, I'm really going to just spend a minute here. But one thing that Tony and I looked at, is alternative approaches to achieving the goals of AB 846, perhaps beyond just evaluating people for their biases. And we looked at two in particular. There's a lot of studies related to motivation not to police in a biased manner. I won't get into it, but the section on AB 846 does. But there are some studies that show that people who have a high internal motivation not to be biased are less likely to act in a biased manner. And by internal motivation, I mean people for whom it's important to their self-concept not to be biased. Whereas externally motivated people are less likely to change their behavior. And external motivation means people for whom it's important to appear not biased to society. So there has been some promising developments in the studies showing that, like I said, highly internally motivated people are less likely to act in a biased manner. However, none of these studies have been replicated in the law enforcement context, which is something that Tony and I had referenced in the report as something that should be encouraged, further research in the law enforcement context, given the promising research that has been done in other contexts. There have also been some studies done on long-term multi-week interventions, meaning working with a cohort of people for many weeks, using various strategies to reduce and address and manage their biases. And some of these studies have found that there have been sustained reductions in people relying on their implicit biases. Again, these have not been replicated in a law enforcement context, and I think that it would be certainly valuable to do that. Finally, our expert, Professor Jack Glazer, posited that it might be useful to look at implicit bias trainings and the impact of supervisors on officers. With respect to implicit bias training, Professor Glazer noted that it appears that there's only been one study done in the policing context, and that specifically was with New York Police Department. And that study did not find any impact on arrests, stops, use of force, and a few other areas. No impact of implicit bias on those different components of policing. We note in the report that, and we stress this, that this isn't a reason to discourage implicit bias trainings. It is rather an important, and it should incentivize people to encourage further research into what types of trainings and the frequency of those trainings that could have a potential impact on policing outcomes. And like I said, Professor Glazer suggested looking at the impact of supervisors on officer stops, like the culture that they provide to their officers. And we suggest in the draft that agencies could consider using RIPA data as an early intervention tool, specifically looking if an officer is policing in a disparate manner compared to other officers during their shift and in the same neighborhood or patrol area. And if that officer is patrolling in a disparate manner or policing in a disparate manner, the agency could look into other types of interventions or trainings to address those disparities. And so these are just some of the things that agencies could consider. And from our perspective, it invites further funding and perhaps legislative fixes to get that funding. But right now, as Melanie had noted, there really hasn't been a lot of research on selection of officers and assessing them for biases in the personnel context. So I want to just go back very quickly over the proposed regulations. Like Melanie mentioned, the proposed regulations have multiple components, but the two that I wanted to direct the subcommittee's attention to are the two proposals related to investigators and evaluators. For investigators, the proposed regulations would require their narrative investigative report to reference this background investigation dimensions, but most importantly, include findings of biased behaviors and or bias relevant traits or attributes per the bias assessment framework. And the bias assessment framework is included in your meeting materials, and it's incorporated by reference in the regulation, so it's part of the proposed regulations. This is very small, so I'm going to zoom in here and hopefully you can see this, and if not, I'm going to try to make this bigger. But as Melanie noted, if you can't see that, let me know if anyone wants to chime in. But as Melanie noted, the proposed regulations would have investigators look at these targeted constructs or different areas, biased behaviors, attitudes, relevant traits, and attributes, and suggest that they look at different data sources for those three constructs: your background and personal history, written instruments, and psychological interviews. Within that, you can look at aggravating and mitigating factors. And on page 42 of your meeting materials, there's an example table of examples of types of factors or sources that you can look at. So for instance, that table suggests looking at social media postings to determine if someone has a history of biased behaviors. So that's the proposed regulation requirement with respect to investigators. With respect to evaluators, so psychological evaluators, they are required to use the bias assessment framework as well and assess bias behaviors, bias attitudes, and bias relevant traits and attributes. So, what we have observed here is that there's significant latitude provided to the the evaluators, the psychological evaluators, in that they can, the regulations say they shall use the bias assessment framework. The bias assessment framework does have 3 footnotes underneath it, and I hope you can read this, but if not, I will just repeat some of them. So
Tanya,
footnote 2.
And if you go into slide view, that would probably make it bigger because I won't have the slides on the side.
I thought I was on that. Okay, thank you. Okay. So if you see here footnote 2, it says that psychological evaluators are required to assess each of these targeted constructs, but the data sources used for the assessments are at the discretion of the evaluator. So again, there's a wide latitude on how you use the bias assessment framework. And then the footnote 3 provides not quite a sliding scale, but does provide some further guidance. So if there is clear and direct evidence of unmitigated bias behaviors or attitudes, other factors are no longer relevant. However, if that direct evidence is unavailable or if it's weak or ambiguous, Post says that it may be useful to consider other related factors and list some of them. One of them does include motivations to respond without prejudice, which is that research that I was mentioning earlier. I'm going to stop sharing because I need to just quickly get to my notes for 1 second. And let me just pull up my screen up again. Okay. Are you seeing my screen right now?
Yeah.
The PowerPoint? I'm going to assume yes. So Post proposed regulations are in line with what their SME panel has developed and frankly in line with the research that Tony and I had looked at. That said, there are, potential areas of improvement that we were able to identify. And one of them is, and I'll switch back to the, let me see if I can find the regulations for you. So one of the things that we had considered is with respect to investigators, the proposed regulations state that investigators shall include any findings of biased behaviors and or relevant traits or attributes. And, you know, Tony and I had discussed this, and we think that a potential area of improvement would be to require investigators to make findings with respect to each targeted construct. And a finding could be simply that I looked at X data sources, I interviewed, including such as interviewing the candidate's family, and found that based on those sources, the candidate did or did not exhibit biased behaviors towards specified identity or racial groups. Similarly, with respect to the evaluators, you know, we think that the discretion provided to psychologists is reasonable given the dearth of research in this area, and to Melanie's point, to provide flexibility, again, because there is not a lot of research here. However, you know, some areas of improvement could be to require the evaluator to specifically spell out their findings with respect to each construct, which sources they did in fact look at in assessing a person's attitudes, behaviors, traits, or attributes, whether there was direct evidence of any biased behavior, attitudes, or attributes. And to, again, to that footnote 3, if the evidence is weak or ambiguous, what factors did the psychologist weigh in determining the person's biases? So these are just some of the potential areas of improvement that we saw. And, you know, as Melanie noted, these are just proposed regulations. They go public tomorrow, September 10th, and that triggers a 45-day window of time during which members of the public can comment on the proposed regulations. So the end date of that comment period is October 25th. And, you know, one potential action that the subcommittee could take is authorizing the co-chairs to work with DOJ staff to develop a comment letter, which could then be presented to the board on October 20th for feedback and then approval. That's one possibility given the very tight timeline that we have. And then additional areas of discussion for the board are other potential legislative fixes that they could think of given the lack of research in this area. And finally, to the extent you think of anything additional that we would want to include in this report or in a future report as well. So that's it about AB 846. Open to any questions, and it looks like Melanie is still here if you also want to ask Melanie any questions as well.
Thank you both for that great presentation. So I'll just, I guess, open up for comments from any board members on either the proposed regulations, things that you might like to see in a letter if we were to submit comments on the regulation formally. And then also at this point, Tanya, should it also be comments on the 846 section of the report as well? If people have any.
Yes, that would be great.
Can I ask a clarifying question, Tanya and Anthony, since you spent so much time researching and thinking about this? I'm wondering about if the spirit of 846 is to add a criteria to the hiring process to screen out people with bias, that could be accomplished, you know, largely through the background investigation or the psychological assessment or some combination of the two. And I wonder, given what I read in the report this morning about, you know, the problems with using an implicit association test and Dr. Eberhardt's assessment, if maybe rather than granting leeway and flexibility for the psychologist to use, you know, the tool of their choosing, maybe more weight should be placed on the background check and what it unearths, and then the psychological assessment of that evidence or the lack thereof or what have you. And I'm just thinking about what are your thoughts in terms of the relative importance of those two components in implementing this legislation?
Tony, I can start if you want to chime in, but
Yeah, that's fine.
I don't know if we looked into the relative weight of either the investigation versus the evaluation. But I think, in looking at the proposed regulations, it did trigger this idea that, perhaps the background investigation needs to have more specific findings, hence the one area of improvement that we had thought of. But our research didn't come across anything that would suggest that the investigation should have more weight or less weight than the evaluation. So I don't want to say that that's the case. So we didn't find anything of that sort. Tony, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, just briefly, I do think that the way that the background, I'm sorry, the way that the recommendations are following the AB 846 post project, it appears that there seems to be a great deal of focus placed on the detail of the background investigation, so that such that the background investigator will amass critical important information that then needs to be, or I'm sorry, that not needs to be, but is now required to be passed on to that evaluator. So, I'm going to echo Tanya to some degree. We did not find research that suggested that one way more heavily than the other. But I sense from the recommendations that the way that it's set up now, it's designed to where the evaluator, that psychologist, will be equipped with tools that they need to make that decision. So it could be a case. I think that if I were an evaluator, I would want all of that information laid out before me so that I could make that critical decision to determine suitability. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, Professor Raphael, but I don't know if Melanie Singley may be able to add something as well. I'm not sure.
No, you're exactly right. So a lot of the psychological evaluation, they're required to review personal history information, background information. That has been a requirement. It is still a requirement, and that is just adding this additional element of this bias assessment framework and giving background investigators and psychologists the tools to kind of direct their investigations and their evaluation. Will assist in making sure that information continues to be provided to the psychological evaluation. It is important that they have that information. It is required by post, so that will continue.
I just have a question that kind of to help understand what's going on and when information is transmitted. Melanie, when you were talking about the psychological evaluator's conclusion that someone has biased behavior or exhibit bad behavior, I don't know if that was super shorthand for what is actually transmitted, but is that the kind of level of finding that the psychologist provides, and kind of if it is like a yes or no, what is the threshold for them determining whether that bias exists or not, or where is that kind of laid out? And then relatedly, kind of what factual findings are kind of implicitly made in that process? So like if the investigator said, and through this like the secondary interviews, like you talk to the family, they might say, oh, in high school there was a complaint that he bullied a black kid, but he was never punished for it, or something like that. How does that work its way into the evaluation? Does the psychologist say like there was no racial bullying? Do they include that fact somewhere for the decision maker to actually decide whether or not they want to view that as relevant? Like how is information transmitted, or what level is it just kind of a decision or a category or a label is placed on the officer or applicant, I should say?
Yeah, so there's the Background investigation is obviously to find that they're of good moral character and don't have anything that would make them unsuitable for peace officer employment, right? The psychological evaluation is the same thing. They have to find that they're suitable for peace officer employment. So the way that the bias assessment framework was designed is that there might be some of those factors, right? Maybe they, a friend in high school knows that they had heard a racial slur from this individual, right? Now it's 5 years later. Are there mitigating factors that would mitigate that issue? Was it so long ago that it's no longer an issue? So those are things that they need to kind of weigh, just as they do now, right? Background history and psychological history. It's like they weigh, what happened, what's happened since that time, are the mitigating factors, which is why we developed it the way we developed it, is there aggravating facilitating factors that say this person might have bias issues. If it's unmitigated, they are biased and there's no doubt about that. They're not going to make it past the background investigation. They shouldn't make it past the background investigation, right? So the psychologist will probably never see that person. Or if they do, then they'll be washed out in the psychological evaluation. So that part is not going to change. As mentioned, what's included in this bias assessment framework is when there's weak issues, when there's things that you don't quite, the evidence isn't quite there, you're not sure, you hear of things, there are things that you might want to look into. Are there mitigating factors? So that's in relation to, again, if you look at the list of bias attitudes, that's kind of where we got that table from as well. It's like, if there were these issues, are there other mitigating factors? Like if there, if there's an absence of empathy, or if there's a lack of tolerance, whatever it might be, are there other mitigating factors that say, well, this person, maybe they're cynical because they've been an officer forever, right? But are there other issues that are going to mitigate that? Like, well, they have a high fear of more, they understand others, they believe in equal rights. There's all these things, there's these other mitigating factors that they would look at. So there's not going to be a scaled chart if that's what you're asking for. No, it just is, it's currently done, it's an assessment of the overall individual, the information they get from the background, as well as the psychological evaluation. So it could be assessments, it could be the background information, it's going to be a lot of it's going to be the clinical interview, gathering all this information and then asking additional information from the candidate, asking for follow-up questions, that sort of thing. And that's going to be based on that information as well, if that hopefully answers your question.
So just speaking of the process, it's basically information is provided to the psychologist, which may include something like reports of race-based bullying or other things. The psychologist looks at everything and then they create a top-line evaluation. This person does not have bias or exhibit whatever the specific language is. It's like does or does not bias kind of thing. Is that accurate?
Right. That would affect the ability to be a peace officer. So there's nothing in their behaviors, traits, etc., that would affect their ability to be a peace officer. I mean, that's the key. Is there something in your behavior, and that could be anything. That could be related to anything. Is there something in your background or that's discussed in the psych eval that's going to affect your ability to exercise, to be a peace officer, essentially?
And where is I'm sorry if you already mentioned it, but where is the instrument or rubric or whatever that's being used for that psychologist to determine these facts culminate to this level of bias that I do think would impact their ability to be a peace officer? Like, what information or guidance are they provided in making that final determination?
So that would be the bias assessment framework, and then that table, the associated table, the list of bias attitudes, traits, attributes. So those are the tools they can use. So it's just like anything. Like I can do an evaluation of you, and I can do someone that's the next person. It's going to be contingent upon the individual themselves. So they're essentially their background history, their personal history, the behavioral history, and then making an assessment based on that information. So is there a scale that says, are you a scale 1 to 10? I mean, no, that's not practical for any number of reasons, because you have to assess their whole history.
Mm-hmm. I guess so. I definitely understand that, but I guess my question is, given the unique world of being a peace officer, right? What someone might say in another context, if the psychologist was evaluating the same person, they might say they don't seem like someone who goes out, committing hate crimes, or that's not likely to be a thing that would happen in their future given the world. But is there some other instrument or tool or anything that has trained the psychologist to understand and evaluate whether or not someone with that same set of factors placed into the role of being a peace officer is likely to potentially cause harm or treat people differently? Or like what training is provided to that psychologist to be able to take all those individual inputs and then make that evaluation and that determination?
Well, they were obviously trained in assessing, screening for anything related to the behaviors of officers. So the tools that we're providing to them are the framework and the non-exhaustive list of factors. So they can use any and all of these in making that determination. So there's no psychological evaluation that's going to say, or psychological exam, like there's no exam exists that says, hey, this person is biased or not. I mean, that's one of the issues, right? There's no assessment that says, hey, you scaled really, really high on this, so you're out. Unfortunately, right? Maybe this will start that process. I don't know. So it's an assessment of the psychologist is they do forensic assessments. They do these assessments all the time. It's not as if they're not familiar with identifying behaviors that are inherent in individual and then determining. So part of that is, again, looking at these mitigating factors. So if there is something that says, well, we're not sure, we heard this, you have this information background, are there mitigating factors that would essentially indicate that this person is not going to be a problem out in the field? Again, there's on the back end, there's very little data on anything related to assessing for this and then how it's done. There's none of that outcome data at this point. Will that happen after this? Hopefully, hopefully there's going to be this data that's coming back. I think part of that, the issue is that we don't have that outcome data. They're not getting information back from, and it could be not even necessarily this, it could be something else in the background. Was there something we missed during the background? Was there something we missed? If someone's failing out in FTO, failing out in the first 6 months, it's like, is there a reason for that? And what is that reason? Do we need to go back and look at the background? Do we need to go back and look at the psychological, or maybe it was something different, right? But it's that those data pieces that are kind of missing at this point, if that's what you're asking.
It's still a little bit different, but we can move on because I do have another question that kind of relates to exactly what you were talking about right now in terms of the outputs, that we don't have these measures yet. And so this has all been focused on the implicit bias screening tools, and I want to make sure that we're also focused on the explicit bias piece, which is also specifically stated in the law as something that they should be evaluating. And on the output side, we do have, in the context of actual practicing officers, not screening process data, but actual practicing officers and the evidence of race-based or various kind of biases expressed in social media in particular, and then the also connecting that to uses of force and lawsuits and complaints. And so I think that it would be very helpful to more explicitly include that as part of the screening process. And I know it's included as an example of something that someone can consider as an aggregating factor, but I think as part of the more explicit pieces of information that have to be collected, I think social media would be a great place to start. And I don't know if there's a reason that was not explicitly included, or that Post opted not to include that explicitly.
It is included. Yeah, right, it is included.
As a example of something that they could consider. And so I just wanted to, but there are if the actual body of the regulation, there are also specific things that, like in the background check, need to be identified. So I'm asking, is there a reason why? I mean, maybe you didn't think of it, and so I would suggest it. But if there was a reason that it was there.
Yeah, part of the reason with including a list of a specific list of areas is that people tend to only explore those list of areas. So they don't then go beyond what's required in regulation. So by having the bias assessment framework, which provides that information, then providing here are the areas that you should consider. And we do talk about that. So it's also included in, again, if you look at the background investigation dimensions and you look at the psychological screening dimensions, which are required to be assessed, by the way, as well. Those are required. Those are in regulation. It discusses all these. It discusses, essentially what are what you call good, or beneficial areas or behaviors, and then those that are indicators of. So those are required, and those are, if you look at that, there's a large list of those as well. So it's covered in other areas too. This is just kind of in addition to that, and it's providing more references for them.
I'm sorry, and maybe I didn't follow the last thing you were saying about them being. So I see those being listed in the biased behaviors examples. I was thinking more of the where personal history information where it says it includes relevant work life and developmental history, like that could maybe include on some social media or something like that.
Right,
Was there
so that's
something else you were saying that I was?
Yeah, the background of it. So the background investigation, they also have to review. They have to look at the background investigation dimensions. There's a list of 10 dimensions, and same thing with the psychological evaluation. So the psychological screening dimensions. And so it has all these different categories, if you will, like social competence and communication and interpersonal communications, that sort of thing. And it gives examples. It gives both definitions of those as well as indicators of what would be essentially past behaviors and what could be a problem. Like if you hired someone with those past behaviors, it could be, it could show up later in their. Does that make sense? So you can, so those
I'm just trying to find that in the material that we were given, but maybe that was something separate from what we have.
So it's in our so it's in the regulation, but it refers to where, so it's in, if you look at the regulation, it says, you're required, it's guidance, like the background manual is guidance, but except for the background investigation dimensions. And that's in chapter 2 of the background investigation manual. And then for the psych screening, it's the same thing. So psych screening dimensions, and I think they're in chapter 4. But anyway, so they're in the background, they're in the peace officer psychological evaluation manual. So those are also required to be assessed. So it's not just this. So there's a larger piece to it. This is just being added to what's already being done, if that makes sense. So it's being added to those lists, if you will.
And so what's included in those lists doesn't have the carve out that you don't have to use those data sources?
No, so the dimensions have to be assessed in the background, and there's separate dimensions that have to be assessed during the psychological evaluation. And then the data sources that are required to be reviewed currently, and will be part of this as well, is psychological evaluators are required to look at background personal history. They're required to look at assessments as well, and they're also required to do a clinical interview. So those are required. Those are currently required, and now within those contexts, they're looking at these. Now they're looking more focused, if you will, on these bias areas.
So is there something that mandates looking at as a data source to determine the background information or any of these other dimensions, social media, or is that discretionary?
I would have to look at the dimensions to see if we specifically call out social media as being, and that's your main focus is social media.
I mean, that's just something that's been documented as a source for explicit bias.
And I don't think it's excluded. Yeah, I don't think it's excluded as social media. So I think it's when you look at it, so the background dimensions, and let me see if I can find. I know you guys are short on time, so I don't want to but I also want to cover this. So let's see. The psych eval, right, makes inappropriate comments to or about others regarding personal characteristics. So I don't think it's necessarily where, and this is current, right? So let's see. Positive, aware of and sensitive to social, economic, and cultural differences, counterproductive behaviors or makes inappropriate comments to others about personal characteristics, as well as derogatory comments about specific groups, racial, gender. So you're talking about sources as opposed to, so this is regardless of the source. So whether it's social media, whether it's from a reference, whether it's from a work colleague, whether it's from somebody else. Like this has to be assessed. So how they get that information, I think limiting to say you have to look at social media, it's like, well, then that's all I have to look at. Well, no, there's all these other areas that you can find it. We don't want to limit it to that one specific. I think you say I get your point is that you want to say you need to look at social media regardless, right? Is that your point? Yeah.
Right.
So
Because right now that could come from just like references potentially. That might be where for primary and secondary references might be the only source to look at to see if he's saying bad comments about different groups, but they have a whole Facebook page or group that they're on, and no one ever looked at that. So I just want to make sure that it's being inclusive.
You're just saying that, calling that out separately is as far as a requirement that they review social media. Yeah, I mean, it's obviously mentioned in here. There is a law that says they can't access someone's personal social media. I know you're probably aware of that, Labor Code 980. You can't require someone to log into their social media. Public information obviously is available publicly. So, and that was implemented probably 4 years ago. So, but that is something that they do look into is publicly available social media information. But I see your point in saying like, hey, that can be called out separately? I think we look at it from the viewpoint of behaviors, not necessarily sources per se. But behaviors and where you get that information from. So it's like, what kind of behaviors are you looking at? And that's what the background dimensions are focused on, are the behaviors, not necessarily the source of that, which could be any. Like, I don't think anything that should be left off the table. I just hate to necessarily start limiting stuff where they go like, that's the only thing I have to look at. Well, no, it could be any source of information. This is what you need to be looking for. So doing an effective evaluation or background investigation should include any and all sources to find this information. Does that help?
Yeah, sorry, Melanie. Thank you for that really helpful explanation. This has been really great and a really great discussion. I just am mindful of the time. It is 1:50 and we do have several other agenda items. But before we move on to another agenda item, I do want to see if the subcommittee members would be interested in taking any action here. Like I mentioned earlier, a potential action could be to authorize the co-chairs to work with DOJ staff on a comment letter that could then be presented to the board on October 20th. That is a potential action. We currently can't vote on any action because board member Hampton is not here, so we don't have quorum to vote on it, but the subcommittee members can at least think about the recommendations that they want to make or potential actions that the subcommittee would want to take, and then you can vote when Edgar is back.
I wanted to give a chance for anyone else to give any comments, but I did have just a few comments on the actual AB 846 section. But I wanted to give space for other folks first.
I guess I don't really know what the content of the comment letter would be. Is that what you'd like us, if we're trying to think about? I mean, I appreciate the research you did, and I read it with interest, and it seemed to me that the bottom line seemed to be that the psychological tools in and of themselves, the diagnostic tools, were not really designed for this particular screening purpose and are probably not going to work. And then there's some of this suggestive research using university students about explicit, implicit motivation and those sorts of things. But it seems a little underdeveloped before we could make a recommendation that psychologists use this to screen. And I wonder especially when I was reading the comments by Eberhard and then by Professor Glaser and his summary of the research on trainings, that it did seem that, again, it just seemed to me that the result of the background checks that we were just discussing and whatever the information that's unearthed, in coordination with some careful evaluation of mitigating factors, that seems to be, perhaps at least at this point, more important. I don't know.
Yeah,
what others...
thank you for that feedback. And just to clarify, the proposed regulations came after we had drafted that section. So we certainly do need to update the section to reflect the substance of the proposed regulations. And so that's why you're not seeing some of the specific areas of improvement that we had mentioned earlier in the presentation. And to your point about what could the comment letter include, Tony and I had thought of at least 2 areas where, there could be more specific findings with respect to the investigative report that the investigator would put forth. So specifically noting the data sources that the investigator used and how they relate to then their finding of whether or not the person is biased in their behavior, attitudes, attributes, or traits. Similarly, the proposed regulations with respect to the evaluator could also include, again, specific findings as to which sources were used. And there's that footnote in the bias assessment framework, and I can pull it up, but it basically says, to the extent that evidence of bias is weak or ambiguous, you have to look at other factors. And so, or Post says it's useful to look at other factors. The proposed regulations could make that stronger, saying you have to look at other factors and specify in your evaluation report what those factors are. And Tony and I had thought of these 2 areas of improvement, specifically perhaps coming from the board, given its goal of increasing transparency among law enforcement agencies. So because we have such a tight timeline in terms of when we would have to turn around a comment, the proposed regulations are public tomorrow, and then we have until the public has until October 25th to make any recommendation. One way we thought it could be more efficient is if the subcommittee were interested in authorizing the co-chairs to work with us on the substance of that letter, and then that could be presented to the larger board for feedback, for tweaking, and then we can refine it during the course of the board meeting and then present the final letter for approval for the larger board. And that's an option. The timeline, of course, is very tight. So that's what we were thinking of to get around the tight timeline.
Does anyone else have any comments on that? And if not, I'll just give my few comments on the motion. I'm sorry, on the...
Really quickly. So I just want to clarify, just to follow up on Tanya's comments. Professor Raphael, at the end of the day, I think right now, just as Tanya said, this is a work in progress. So we've got to update, we've got to go back into the body and update some of the material as it relates to, alternatives to bias testing. We need to update that material. But what we can focus on right now would be the proposed recommendations. So we can look at, we have the bias assessment tool in front of us. That's really what we're looking at, the bias assessment tool in relation, and the regulations. And from that, Tanya elevated, or we both elevated the idea of, well, there would be two proposals, one for the background investigation, the other for the psychological evaluators. And in both cases, the idea would be to take a look at it from a transparency angle and to see how we could, strengthen the recommendations from a transparency standpoint. And one idea what might be to provide very detailed findings from the background investigator, detailed findings from the psychological evaluator. Sorry about that, Melanie. Just wanted to clarify that.
And I can just add, I don't know how my co-chair feels, but if folks do want to move forward that way, I'm happy to work with the DOJ on the letter. And then the one thing that I would add potentially to the letter is to flag the explicit bias piece that I was discussing, to incorporate that in some way as a mandatory, social media as a mandatory element that needs to be evaluated? Are there other thoughts on the letter process or whether or not folks want to do that?
I think the letter is a good idea. I support the letter.
So what we could do is wait until Board Member Hampton is back to actually officially move on a comment letter, or specifically on authorizing Co-Chair Ochoa to work with the DOJ on that letter. And then Allison, correct me if I'm wrong, do we need to?
Co-Chair Woods.
Oh, and Co-Chair Woods. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you out, but just.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Melanie.
I just thought that Co-Chair Ochoa volunteered, so I didn't want to volunteer you without your permission. But Allison, does this require a second motion, like a threshold motion to at least present a comment letter to the board and then also to authorize the co-chairs to work with us? Okay.
Yes. So it would be two different motions.
Gotcha.
But and the board can hear public comment. If the board has the idea about this, you can hear public comment, and we can cover that in next steps when Edgar is back.
Okay.
Thank you, Allison.
Public comments. Let's hear them.
Okay, so if that's all for that, just my only comments, or my main comments on the Section 846 summary. I really appreciated the discussion of the research and putting that in context. One thing, again, kind of in line with those comments and comments I've made before, is really acknowledging explicit bias. It exists. It's out there. It happens. It's happening. We know it. It's being tracked. It's being documented. It's happening in California jurisdictions on a regular basis. Like I can name at least a couple things off the top of my head, like that happened in the last couple of years just in California, with officers doing like explicitly really racist things. So I think one piece in way that the section could be kind of amended on page 28, the last sentence before going into the kind of suggestions and ways forward, it says, because there do not appear to be precise tests to measure bias, post and law enforcement agencies could consider other approaches to reducing bias policing. And maybe the first thing to identify there is making like intensive efforts to screen for explicit bias as something on that piece, and kind of maybe discuss some of the research on that and the relationship that it has to actual policing impacts. And I think that would be a good place to start before even getting into the implicit bias, because I do agree it's more unclear in the relationship and how that is appropriately tested. One thing when going into the studies, I think the initial study that was discussed was like about guilt, people feeling guilt if they had this like internal motivation versus external motivation. And I didn't see any, and maybe this was in the actual study, but it didn't discuss whether racist conduct was then less frequent, or they just felt more bad about it when they did it anyway. But the study cited, at least as described in footnote 36, seems to be more about actually racist actions, and I think that's the more important study to highlight here. And it connects also explicit bias to higher rates of implicit bias. So like even if you're not if you don't have good measure for testing implicit bias, you're probably catching that if you're doing explicit bias. I think those are two kind of relevant things. And the other study also seems more relevant to procedural justice issue when it's talking about how people who are internally motivated actually engage with folks of other races. I think just as in terms of what studies you highlight in that body, those two seemed actually more maybe more relevant. I don't know if there's other reasons why you chose to highlight the one you did. But I thought it was useful to have for sure to explain kind of the limitations of the data and how this is like a possible way forward. But I thought those were kind of the seemingly more relevant to the question. And I would just kind of on page 31, when we're talking about the long-term engagements, and it says it's unclear whether that is like a practical in the policing context. I think given the amount of like resources and authorities and things that we give to police, like I think that we don't necessarily want to suggest that it's like not practical to do like 12 weeks of surveys for someone if that would actually, impact people killing someone else. You know what I mean? So I think maybe just crossing out like practicality as like a question right there. In the
Yeah, I mean,
text.
just to that point, the only reason why I included that was just the interventions were these like sort of intense sessions that involve strategies. But to your point, we can take that language out because it wasn't just like survey, which I understand would obviously be very easy to replicate. But yeah, we can definitely take that out given that there are significant resources. So yeah, I just want to make that one point about the interventions.
All right, thank you for clarifying. And that was all my comments on that.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And Board Member Raphael, I did want to point out that we captured your comment about updating the language in the section about the regulations and then kind of making it more in line with our research as well. So now that we have the proposed regulations, we certainly will be updating it.
Are there any more comments on that section of the report? Otherwise, I think we're going to table the letter piece and just move on to the next section. But I'm sorry, there was one other thing with respect to post that I guess is the best place for me to ask the question, just in case we lose all the post folks. Just there was a question as to whether we provided some feedback on Learning Domain 3, and I'm just curious as to how Post was intending to consider that or incorporate that into anything going forward. What was kind of the next step to be taken from that?
To be very honest, I have not received that feedback, so I'm not sure who it was sent to. So I guess that answers your question.
I'm not sure if there's anyone from DOJ that can comment on that, or if we'll just table it till next time.
Maybe it makes sense for the DOJ to go through their presentation because the board summarized their comments in the last subcommittee meeting, which I do believe members of Post were in attendance of as well.
Okay, thank you, Kendall. So yeah, let's go ahead and with DOJ's presentation.
Okay, great. This is Aisha. Good afternoon. Myself and Kendall Mickelwaite will be going over the next section, which is the next agenda item on the discussion of training and the board report. So next slide. Thank you, Kendall. First, I'd like to just kind of quickly summarize that last year's work by the board and the subcommittee, you focused on analyzing post trainings on bias-free policing and continuing the work in terms of reviewing courses that focus on identity profiling. And that leads us to the discussion that you've previously had with respect to the supervisor's course. And Post has now given you the opportunity, if we get your names over to them this afternoon, to have you take a look at that particular course, which is also very important. And we'd just like to add and ask the board members to CC DOJ on your comments so that we can compile them, because it provides a record for the annual report. So, and then also going forward, the board will continue to review the Learning Domain 3, which